Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Ronna, and joining me again tonight, I guess we do it a couple times a year at least, is Mike Alewitz, local artist and activist. They're kind of merged,
yes,
I think. And we're going to talk about the student protests and what their value is, how we can protect the people involved in them. And Mike, you have kind of, maybe not quite unique, but a very strong experience from your past of participating in student movements in a time when the students were really treated abominably. So do you want to talk about that just a little?
For sure. As you know, I was a student at Kent State, a leader of the anti-war movement there, and an eyewitness to the massacre of May 4th. There was a long history that led up to that, and of course, the school there and the state and federal government have led a very concerted effort to erase that history and to rewrite the history of what happened there, including the fight for civil liberties that occurred on the campus. In fact, some years ago, they put the person who became in charge of the commemorations there was a woman named Stephanie Dane Smith, who was a top CIA official, who worked directly with Condoleezza Rice, planning the tortures and stuff. And the state has taken a keen interest in Kent and trying to erase that experience, both because of the massacres at Kent, Augusta, and Jackson, and also the response that happened, the national student strike that followed the shootings and the invasion of Cambodia, because there were 400 universities that were occupied. And it was the largest demonstration in American history up to that point, at least, although we've had some things that may have matched that in recent years, which is important to keep in mind. But coming out of the 50s and into the 60s, the idea that you could protest on campus didn't exist. You weren't allowed to have clubs, you weren't allowed to have anti-war demonstrations, those things didn't exist. We had to fight and win those things. And that occurred, during the 60s, basically.
I have a hard time conveying when I'm talking to younger friends of mine how incredibly repressed the 50s and early 60s were. There are no words to actually communicate what it was like to be a child in those times.
It was horrible. This idea that this was the great time. And you see a lot of this stuff. You see a lot of it, there's all this nostalgia for these things. You see a lot of it in New London. People who are nostalgic for the good old days, when there weren't protests and stuff. And this is before the women's movement. I grew up in a segregated housing project outside Wilmington, Delaware, next to a youth prison farm, black youth, that was where they kept them in chicken coops.
Oh my God.
And, it was like something out of the 1930s. And, in our development, it was, all white. you know, people beat their wives. If you were gay, forget it. You just had to leave. You know, and it was incredibly stifling. There was no outlets for creative activity or anything like that. It was really, really backward. There was no great things about it. It's just been romanticized. And during the 60s, of course, because of the colonial revolution, because of international events that were taking place, gave the opening for the beginning of the civil rights movement, and that's what began to change things. I grew up in a segregated place. We didn't go to certain stores because my family were lefties, so we couldn't go to certain stores where they wouldn't serve black people. My sister was arrested desegregating the University of Delaware when I was a little kid. That Biden touted so much, the University of Delaware, and you know, you couldn't. At the beginning, in terms of anti-war and political activity, it was very mild. It was the pacifists, basically, until SDS called the first March on Washington in 1964, which was directly opposed to the Vietnam War. Unfortunately, after that, SDS refused to participate in the anti-war movement after that. But groups like the Student Mobilization Committee, which I was involved in, organized mass demonstrations. At Kent, we had mass demonstrations that eventually involved thousands of students, which has been totally erased from the history. They have these big commemorations every year, and they've just erased the mass anti-war movement.
Well, our culture does tend to revere the dead heroes and erase what they really did, and of course revile the living ones who you can't really misrepresent so easily.
Well, you know, they tell us who our heroes should be, and you know, so a lot of times, you know, people, well, the whole SDS thing, for example, I mean, that's who they put forward as, with this romanticized version of what was going on, when in fact they basically abstained from the anti-war movement. Not that there weren't a lot of great activists in that group. Similarly with the Black Panther Party, you know, it was largely romanticized. Not that there weren't some great actions and some important people that came out of that. But in terms of movements that really fundamentally altered the course of history, you're talking about the mass civil rights movement, which was led by, you know, the black churches and civil rights, and to some extent with the support of the unions. And in terms of the anti-war movement, mass movement on campus that reached out into the working class and eventually won the army over, and that's what ended the war in Vietnam, when the army refused to fight in Vietnam. But to get to that point where we could have these things, we had to fight for civil rights, civil liberties on campus. At first, you know, in the 60s, you couldn't have an anti-war group that would be recognized on campus. You know, you couldn't conduct demonstrations. You couldn't have a socialist club, that's for sure. And high schools were even more restrictive. We had actions like handing out the Bill of Rights. We would go hand out the Bill of Rights and get arrested for handing out the Bill of Rights, you know.
Well, it was, I have to tell you, so my sister was 4 years older than I, and she went to University of Pennsylvania. I grew up in Philadelphia, so in high school I could use her pass and go to their library. And until 1967 or 8, if I wanted to go to the University of Pennsylvania library, I had to wear a skirt.
Yes.
So, I mean, so you're talking about like all the it was so silly that girls could not wear pants in a library.
Yeah, no, all that stuff. It's hard to imagine it. And of course, even within the movement itself, until the women's movement came along, it was the same kind of thing that, go make the coffee. People tend to romanticize the radicalism of the 60s, and there were wonderful things that happened with with the changing culture and the opening of sexual liberation and all these things. It was very exciting, but it didn't happen overnight. it was a big struggle, and at Kent, actually, it had taken place earlier, but it was one of the campuses that had kind of a history, and so when I got there in 1968, it had already established, a right to protest to a great extent. We organized, at one point, for example, SDS, which tended to be ultra-left, did an action and got themselves arrested, and we organized a civil defense. We had a demonstration of thousands of students that marched on campus. And all this led up to when the invasion of Cambodia took place, and then we had, many thousands of people. By that time, it was an anti-war campus, basically.
How many students are there?
There were like 19,000, I think. And it was a big school. It was a totally working class school. At the time, Akron was the rubber capital of the world. Youngstown was the steel capital. Cleveland was a manufacturing capital, and Kent was right in between those. So we were all the children of, industrial workers mostly.
Now, were there strong unions at the time or not?
Well, they were the unions coming out of, the 50s, and there were some exceptions as we built the anti-war movement. In Cleveland, the meatpackers had a militant history. There were exceptions here and there, but by and large, unions were identified with the government, and it took a long time to break that up. And, to a great extent, it still exists. People who think, tout themselves as being real progressive labor officials like Shawn Fain or O'Brien from the Teamsters, they totally identify with Trump's foreign policy, and it's disgraceful. And in fact, the total absence of union officials calling for actions around this horrific assault on workers' rights, international, immigrant workers, on the unions themselves. They come up and they tear up the contract with the federal workers, and there's no response from the AFL-CIO. And it's a disgrace. What they've done over the many years is they've turned some of these big unions into corporate structures, basically. They have, hundreds of millions of dollars in pension funds and things, and that's why some of them oppose national health care. It wouldn't be good for the bottom line. And of course, the officials themselves, many of them are millionaires. So there's this big gap between the officials and what's going on with the members. What's going on with the members is a very different thing. And it's wonderful to see these demonstrations that are taking place. A lot of it is just confused, and I don't think really addresses itself to a lot of the central questions. But it's a genuine rebellion against what's happening under the Trump regime, but it's just people doing it. There's no leadership to it. There's no unions haven't called it. Civil rights groups haven't called it. Women's groups haven't called it. It's just people doing it, and it's great to see. But really, unions could put an end to all this stuff in one day. In one day, all they'd have to do is call for a march on Washington and say, we're going to stay here until we have Medicare for all, until you stop the assaults on immigrant workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it would be over.
I know, I have to say, maybe it's just because I'm getting old and I don't enjoy the big crowds like I used to. But I've kind of stopped going to demonstrations on weekends. It's like if you're planning it for a time that purposely won't be too disruptive, I think you're doing it wrong.
Well, listen, New London is a perfect example. The demos, I've been to the 2 demonstrations here, and it's a perfect example of what's very positive and what's not so positive. It's a very creative group. Everybody comes, they make these funny signs, they're very insightful, a lot of them. And people are very good, but the crowd itself is older, very few young people. And the demands or the signs, the slogans are very abstract. We're for democracy. Well, what the hell does that mean? I had a sign that said Free Palestine, and I didn't see another Palestine sign there. And there were, a couple thousand people at the first one, and at least 500 at the last one. Here's a genocide that's going on, and this is, and we're across the river. Well, now we're not across the river. We're right next to the sub base where they make nuclear submarines. So, and it's all being funneled back into the Democratic Party, and that's all these big rallies that Sanders and AOC are doing. It's just designed to get people so they stay in the Democratic Party or get back into the Democratic Party if they've already had enough sense to leave. And they're trying to keep a lid on things. And that's why they're letting these actions happen, too. There's been no police haven't attacked any of these demonstrations or anything because they want to let people let off some steam so they can continue this dreadful assault on everything. On democratic rights, on education, on health care, you name it. They're totally emboldened by the absence of a response from the labor movement. So they keep going. They keep going, and it's very serious. Hopefully we'll get through this program. Nobody's going to knock on the door out here and say, well,
Yeah.
You're a member of a terrorist group.
I was texting with my brother who lives in Austin, and he had, I sent him a picture of like me having my picture in the newspaper. He said, "You must be on a lot of lists." And I said, "Actually, I think not. When we used to fly to the West Coast, even though we were young enough that we didn't need it, we had, for years, we were like TSA pre-screen. They just automatically put it on our ticket that we were okay."
Well, that doesn't mean you aren't on lists.
We might be on some list. I don't know. Bob's probably on some list.
Trust me, you're on lists. I never bothered to get my FBI files until, I guess it's been 10 years or so now. And 1,200 documents. They're just following me around everywhere. J. Edgar Hoover is asking where I am, and they after Kent they did a whole thing nationally, where they were trying to set me up nationally. They couldn't do it because we were always very careful, not allowing ourselves to be put in, not saying things that could come back to haunt you. And I'll say this to anybody who's listening, don't make jokes about the guy who killed the CEO of the healthcare thing. Don't joke about these things. Don't joke about violence directed at right-wingers and stuff. First of all, that's not going to change anything. And second of all, it's just going to open up you to be victimized. And it will come back to you. A joke will come back to you.
And now more and more, even those of us who are in relatively privileged groups could have it come back to us.
Absolutely. And fortunately, I was trained by people who came out of the, big labor fights of the 1930s and going back from that, and learned to always have what were called defensive formulations. You always say things in such a way that it can't come back on you. And it makes it clear who's responsible for the violence, who's responsible for the repression, who's responsible for the anti-Semitism, all this kind of stuff. And that's the ruling class and their toadies of all varieties. The ones that are know-nothings like Trump, the ones that are just smoke and mirrors like Sanders, or even ones who have cute dimples. You know, it's all part of the same thing, and it's designed to keep us from being able to exercise or have a real voice in matters, that prevent the working class from having a real voice in things. But there's going to be a social explosion. You know, they can't. You know, what they do today or yesterday, the debt collectors are going to garnish your wages for your student loans, which, you know, there's millions of kids, you know, and you know, it's all these nightmarish things that they're doing. People are going to have to fight back, and they will. People won't have a choice, you know, they won't have a choice.
I think that's true, and I think the demographics of the demonstrations we're starting to see is people who never thought they would have to think about this kind of thing, have to think about it.
Yeah, well, like you were saying before, you know, we've been living people in this country live in a little bubble. And, you know, here in New London, it's a double bubble.
Oh, my God. So I do have a few photos back from Kent State that I don't want to dwell on too much, but maybe we can show them and you can talk
Sure.
a little bit about what happened there.
Well, this is the day of the shootings. You know, Nixon had announced the invasion of Cambodia, and a national student strike began with the announcement of the invasion. And then a couple days later, you know, there were the shootings at Kent. There were some, I won't get into all the provocations and stuff, but the National Guard occupied the campus, and we were out on May 4th to protest the military occupation of the campus and the war, the escalation of the war in Southeast Asia. And these slides show the demonstration was broken up by the National Guards firing barrages of tear gas at us, and it was over. And at that point, and people were wandering off and whatever, and that's when they opened fire. It was quite deliberate. And there was an armed FBI agent in the crowd who's never been forced to testify, who's shown with a pistol in the hand. And, you know, so what they had in mind, how they set it up, the whole thing, in my slideshows about Kent, by the way, which I'm giving on, where did I put my, I'm looking for the information. April 29th at 6 p.m. in the Old Lyme Library. I'll show the whole, you know, thing of events, which I've done here before. But,
yeah.
You know, Nixon wanted to, thought that if, you know, you shot some students, people would be afraid and they'd stop demonstrating. But of course the opposite happened, and it just was like throwing gasoline on the strike that had started, and the whole country exploded. And out of that had a deep effect on the army, and soldiers who had been organizing against the war. That became a majority fact within the armed forces, and the army refused to fight in Vietnam and started killing their officers. They've erased that bit of history too.
Well, and I often wonder, and I happened to be out of the country at the time. We left in 1969 and came back in 1974. But I wonder about the National Guard, because I knew students who, once they graduated, they joined the National Guard so they wouldn't get drafted.
Sure.
And those people I know 50 years ago, I can't imagine that they would have been too happy getting an assignment to shoot students. So
Oh no,
how does that work?
most of them didn't. If they had all shot at the students, there would have been many more than 4 killed and 11 wounded. It would have been great carnage. No, actually the National Guard that was sent to Kent, and this is something they've tried to erase from history. They had been on duty against a Teamster strike that was going on throughout Ohio. There was a Teamster strike going on. The National Guard had been sent against the Teamsters. And then they came onto campus, and as you point out, there was a lot of fraternization because they were just mostly like us. They had just gone into the Guard so they wouldn't go to Vietnam. Because that's, for people like me, I graduated in high school at the beginning of '68, that was the question. It wasn't like, what are you going to do with your life? What kind of career do you want? All that kind of stuff. It was kind of simple. It was like, what are you going to do about the war? How are you going to deal with it? And people had all different kinds of solutions. Of course, there were still people who believed in it, and they went into the armed forces. But most people tried to figure a way out of it. My brother went to Canada. I had a friend who just kept moving every 3 months, so the paperwork didn't catch up with him. People shot their toes off.
Ironically, we ended up in Israel.
Well,
and did write letters back and forth to Bob's draft board, and he spent maybe one day under arrest when we got back to the country, and then the charges were dropped.
well, maybe you'll be deported now, Bob. I don't know.
Oh, who knows?
Well, and a lot of people went into the Coast Guard. People would go into the Coast Guard or the Air Force, even so that you didn't, or the Navy. The last thing you wanted to do was go into the Army and end up in the infantry in the Army, because that was where the real hell was taking place. And that was also where the real heart of the anti-war movement developed within the Army, led by mostly black and Latino soldiers who died in disproportionate numbers. It was the only time they were treated first to go out and die. And that movement, and there's a wonderful movie called Sir, No Sir that I would encourage people to watch to get a feel for what is possible for us to do in our masses without leaders, what it is possible to do. And because that experience for me, I have total confidence in the working class to change society. Because I went through that, and we did it. We ended a shooting war. It had never been done before, and it changed the world. It changed the world. It changed culture of this country. People became anti-war. American people are anti-war to this day. They're anti-war to this day. Now, it doesn't stop them from waging wars, but they have to do it in a very different way. They can't occupy countries anymore. They couldn't even defeat this little ragtag, outfits in places like Afghanistan. Because in order to do that, you have to send troops onto the ground. And once you have troops on the ground fighting with other people, it affects you. It affects you. And people start going, why am I doing this?
Which is a very good question.
Yes. Well, and as dreadful and as much as they brainwashed a lot of the people in Israel, and as dreadful as some of the anti-Arab stuff is, you can bet that a lot of the people who are being forced to go into Gaza and do these horrible things to people are going to be affected by it.
Oh, tremendously. And there is actually a growing refusenick movement there, and it isn't like here. People who won't go into the military there really are discriminated against.
Yeah. Well, it's, you, of course, spent time there, and I spent a little time there, and, they've done a job on convincing people to support that stuff. But it's the same problems. First of all, the economy of Israel is going to collapse. They can't keep doing this. There is no end to the thing. And for the first time in my life, the veil has been ripped away from this thing, and people around the world see what Israel is. It's a military base put in place by the United States and the Western imperialist powers, and
Absolutely.
it's conducting a genocide, and the cruel fate, turn of history is that the people who have been convinced to do this were themselves the victims of exactly what they're doing now to the Palestinians.
And honestly, that kind of makes me feel like, many of us, I know there are Jewish Americans who are feeding into the propaganda, but there are a lot of us who feel like it's kind of our responsibility because it's so easy for someone who defends Palestine to be labeled anti-Semitic. But 23andMe says I'm 99.5%.
Well, well, I have faced as an anti-Zionist. We used to just catch hell, and it was very hard to speak out against anything in Israel. And now, for the first time, I'm so proud of these kids who are doing this stuff, the Jewish Voices for Peace and the students, the Jewish students, and everything. It's like for the first time they're looking at the history of Jews.
Yeah.
For the first time, not as victims, but as social activists who were anarchists and socialists and communists, and working class activists, and great working class fighters. And that's the real tradition for Jews, and it's great to see it happen. And this thing of trying to justify these assaults on education by saying that these students are anti-Semitic is no one is buying that. No one's buying that. Well, you're going to get some right-wing things, but the problem for the right-wingers is that they really are anti-Semitic. So, they're put in the rather awkward position.
It is a very weird situation. The Christian Zionists, ever since 25 years ago, I read about the whole red heifer stuff and trying to build a third temple. It's like these evangelist Zionists, I think they're the scariest bunch out there.
Well, there's a lot of scary people who have a little wind in their sails. A lot of these people are looking for the end times. So, nuclear war, let's get it on,
Armageddon, go to, Megiddo Mountain. Now, Kent State, what happened there wasn't really isolated, and I just wanted to show one mural I think you did on Jackson.
Well, I think what you're going to show. Oh, right. This is a detail.
Oh, yeah. I couldn't find the whole thing. I don't think.
Yeah, myself and it's a commemorative banner. Myself and a faculty member at Central Connecticut State University, where I was teaching. He was from Jackson State. So on the 40th anniversary, we painted a 40-foot banner, and
this is like 1 foot of it.
Yeah,
right?
It has Augusta in it, and it has Jackson State. The big deal was about Kent, and then Jackson State, the massacre at Jackson took place 10 days later, and that became, a lot of the progressives put that into it too. They said you can't just say Kent and Jackson. What nobody did, though, was talk about Augusta.
And I know nothing about Augusta, so tell me.
Augusta, there was a urban uprising in Augusta. The tortured, mentally challenged youth was tortured and killed by the cops and dumped at a local hospital. And there was an uprising. And there was a massacre that took place. Six people were killed, and dozens were wounded, all shot in the back. And because they were protesting this outrageous assault, and there'd been a long history of that, as in other places too. I mean, that was true in Jackson too. But because these were poor black workers, nobody talked about it, as far as I know. You know, socialist groups talk about it, and I included that. And I've painted about that. You know, and it's part of our history that we have to, most of our history has been erased. You know, May Day is coming up, and May Day is a commemoration of the fight for the 8-hour day in Chicago and the frame up of anarchist leaders of the fight for the 8-hour day who were executed. And the whole world celebrates May Day. It's a commemoration of the militancy of the North American labor movement. And we have been robbed of our history. And at Red Square, you know, I have a display about that. And people come through, trade union activists, college professors. Nobody knows this history. It's been totally erased. And it's not surprising when you think about it, you know, because until we had fights for black studies programs and fights for women's studies programs, all that history was missing. When I started going to Kent, we were fighting for a black studies program. Malcolm X wasn't in print. The only Malcolm X you could get was through a socialist newspaper. You know, nobody knew who Harriet Tubman was, or Marcus Garvey, or, you know, all this stuff. A lot of people still don't. Or they get the sanitized version, you know. They get the Harriet Tubman, who led people, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. They don't get the Harriet Tubman that led troops in battle, you know, on the eastern shore of Maryland. You know, they get Martin Luther King, who said, "I have a dream." You know, they don't get Martin Luther King, who got arrested and beaten, you know, consistently fighting for black workers. He was a militant and a very radical thinker. You know, our history's been erased. I have to deal with Kent every year due to my unique situation. And, you know, they've done quite a job in erasing the history there. You know, there's some of us who try to, you know, put a light on this thing. But, you know, history is about today, and we're always fighting for it. And one of the things we really have to relearn is history of how the working class made social advances in this country. You know, we could shut this whole thing down with Trump in a day. It's my union. I'm in the United Scenic Artists Union. You know, we're scenic painters, but we're part of YAHTSE, which is, you know, has media people, camera people, all this kind of stuff. A little tiny union that would stop working, you know, communication stops. Any one of the railroad brotherhoods, the whole country will shut down. Communication workers can shut down the country. You know, we have this tremendous potential power. And nobody's expecting, you know, these millionaire labor officials to call for a general strike right now. But they could call for a march on Washington. They could get out of the way and let us do it, you know, which is the best you can anticipate, you know, is them getting out of the way. So all they have to do is, and that's why they're so afraid to do it. They're terrified. They're terrified. They are far more terrified of their members than they are of the ruling class, even though they are afraid of the ruling class, because they're parasites. You have to keep the host alive. You have to keep the working class alive. You have to keep, you know, basic unions, at least to some extent there.
It's kind of a very weird thing that the people up top who are really dependent on the workers I don't get why sometimes they treat the workers really crappily. You know, I,
They're not, you know, I was a sign painter and I did a lot of work for, just like commercial work, painting banners and stuff for unions. And I quickly realized, this goes back decades, I immediately realized these people do not consider themselves, in a sense, in any sense like we would, that they're part of a movement. They use that word, they say the labor movement, but really it's a job. They're bureaucrats. You know, they could go work for the company. They could go work for the union. And they're they have very privileged positions, and they control basically corporate wealth, billions of dollars in corporate wealth. And so they're not like workers. They don't identify. That's why they talk about the middle class. They talk about the middle class. What is that? Well, to them, you know, it's the nuclear family that makes a decent wage. And it's not the working class. They don't use the term working class. If they're terrified to call an action, because if they called a March on Washington, for example, you're going to get 2 million people in Washington who are going to all be going, what are we going to do now? Let's do something now. Let's go shut it down now. And that scares them a lot.
okay, so fast forward to today.
Yes.
So we get here. And just as the Vietnam War and the invasion of Cambodia were catalysts for a big movement then, the genocide in Gaza, which to me was obvious, was intended to be a genocide from, you know, October 8th, really.
Yeah.
If your first target is a hospital.
Well, 1948.
Well, yeah. But, you know, true.
Yeah.
But more recently,
Right.
that the invasion of Gaza, starting with and continuing to be targeting the most vulnerable people there. So it's not a war when you're doing that.
It's not a war.
So we've seen a similar kind of student movement coalescing around, this is something horrible, we have to stop it. So what do you see as the things that these students have accomplished, and what threats are they facing, and how can we help them?
Well, it's a very different situation, I think, today, because it's a different world. It's a different world situation. The U.S., what's going on around the world, and this is how everything gets boiled down, is because the empire's dying. The American empire's dying. The U.S. Has now to compete with Russian imperialism, Chinese imperialism, the European Union. The U.S., which basically relies on its massive military might, but is no longer the preeminent, in the same way,
Right.
The preeminent imperial power. It can't dictate to these people in the same way anymore. So what you have, it's the periodic crisis of capitalism, just as it led to World War I, just as it led to World War II. So now you have this inter-imperialist rivalry that's heating up. And so rearming, new kinds of weapons systems, and, we're heading towards a world war. But at the same time, the out-of-control greed of these late capitalists is such that the destruction of the environment is going to threatens the species as well. So really what we're faced with today, and what young people are faced with today, is something much more difficult and challenging than the war in Vietnam, as great as that was. We're fighting for the survival of the species. And we don't have organizations at this point. We just have a lot of pissed off people. And a lot of these people who've supported Trump because they were pissed off at the way things were, so they support Trump. Now, at some point, they're going to be also pissed off at Trump too. That's
He deserves it.
well,
Yeah.
they're horrible. I mean, they're really sociopaths, and they go home and torture animals. I'm sure they do. And these are people that have no empathy for anyone. And they take great pride in not knowing anything. The Nazis, the German Nazis, were intellectually light years ahead of these people. These are the real dregs, and it's hard to be dregs compared to Nazis.
Really. So starting last spring, we were seeing a lot of student encampments, and I fear we don't have a whole lot of time.
Oops.
So
Yes.
Columbia made the news quite a bit, and there were encampments all over Connecticut, Yukon, Wesleyan, Yale. And what are these students facing? There were arrests, and different universities really treated it very differently, one from the other.
Well, Columbia capitulated immediately, which is not all that surprising. Now Harvard is making little peeping noises because it's not because they're in defend democratic rights at Harvard, but it's a different corporate entity. And, these are all differences within the ruling class, and has nothing to do with democratic rights for students. And we don't know all the machinations. We don't know what deals are being made. We don't know why one day they want to support Zelensky in Ukraine and the next day they want to support Putin. But you can bet that there's a lot of deals that are going on around these things. And from our point of view, of course, the central question, in my opinion, is that Ukraine has a right to determine its own future, even if it's being run by obnoxious capitalists also. And I work there, and I support the Ukraine working class in their fight against the Russian invasion. But what's happened is that there's been this kind of stunned reaction from people who did not anticipate what they were going to do. They didn't get that this was going to be really so serious. And now people are starting to get it. And before I forget, there is going to be a big meeting on April 26th, a civil liberties, union rights, right to organize meeting at United Methodist Church in New Haven. And it's been endorsed by a number of unions
Yeah, I
and
think
groups.
Party of Connecticut was one of the endorsers.
Yeah, and this is very important. It's not going to be a huge meeting, I don't think, but this is the organic process that has to take place. This is the organic process. This is what happens. You get, locals get together. We start to organize things here. This is happening all over the place. We have to build a movement, and we have to build it from the ground up. And we're in a good position to do that. Young people today are actually a lot smarter and able to organize a lot better than we did during the 60s. We look back in those times with, and we love the culture and things that came out of it. But the fact of the matter is, today's young people have a worldview that is much greater. They can, they have access to the whole world. And you can't have giant demonstrations going on all over the world and not have them happen here. That's how the big campus demonstrations happened in the U.S. during Vietnam. We watched what happened in Italy. We watched what happened in Spain. We watched what happened in Mexico, and especially in France in May, June of 1968. And we copied it, and that's what's happening.
And I think we've seen here, like in New London area, that some of the actions that have been organized by the young New Londoners are really more impressive than the old people who are. I'm glad to see everyone out. We need to get to know each other.
It's the usual suspects.
So we have like 3 more minutes left, and we didn't really talk about threats to free speech or what those of us who are older can do to support the students in who are putting themselves on the line in many cases.
Well, that, I think, and that's why I'm
That's
glad
what-
I was able to get to this before I forgot, because this is where we have to hash out plans to do that. What we need to do is build broad-based defense of these students and of democratic rights. And that, again, is not happening through unions. It's not happening through the universities. All of the people who should be defending democratic rights have totally capitulated or are just inactive. So we have to do it, and we can do it, just the way we established those rights in the first place. Those fights never go away. You're always fighting for democratic rights. Now we're facing some, it's very difficult now, but there's a lot of stuff that's going on. A lot of it isn't covered in the media. There have been some big demonstrations by immigrant workers, especially out on the West Coast. And the fact that that's happening, they're not as big as they were, a few years ago, but that's certainly reasonable. People are afraid of being deported, and it's very real in the
And that's
immigrant
really
community.
going to affect our economy, which might get more awareness.
Well, things are going to get a lot worse. I mean, the whole thing's going to go down the crapper, basically. And no, there's going to be very hard times ahead. And the ruling class knows that, and that's what a lot of these draconian measures are about. It's not so much that they feel threatened now, because they're not.
Right.
They're not threatened fundamentally, but they know it's coming. So they want to establish this stuff. They want to begin to go after people. They want to begin to really terrorize people because they know. And at a certain point, they're going to unleash these right-wingers too. There's going to be violence directed against the left and stuff. But we have a long and proud tradition in this country of fighting for democratic rights, and we have to relearn those things, and we can do that. And it can happen very quickly. It can happen very quickly. We have an internet today. How do these demonstrations happen? It's just word of mouth, from what I can tell. There's some people from the Democratic Party who for their own reasons want to have demonstrations and stuff. But we have to do this everywhere. And there's a lot of it that's going on. There's a lot of, people going and defending their neighbors, when ICE comes to get them and stuff. There's a lot of this stuff that's percolating, and we have to try to draw it together. This meeting in New Haven is very important because it's a little model of how you do this. You get all the groups together, that want to defend democratic rights. And if you do that in New Haven, and you do it in Hartford, and you do it in New London, and you do it everywhere, and you have big ones in Chicago, then the next thing you know, you're building a national movement to defend democratic rights.
And on our last word, maybe, because we really are pretty out of time, building our communities even within our towns, I think, is a piece of it. One little comment about the community garden struggle that we're going through in New London. One of the interesting things about that community garden is that the gardeners are hardly any of them in the same social circle as each other. And so it's been very interesting to be in this fight with people that you would not normally socialize. And I think we're going to have to do it because we're all part of the us.
Yes. I mean, that's very, when I went to the demonstrations here, it's mostly older white liberals, and very few people of color. But this town is half people of color. There's a different political life going on there. They're organizing, they're discussing too, but in a different way. And you're absolutely right. What we need to do is bring this all together. We need to bring it all together. because it's everybody. Democratic rights, you either have them or you don't, and they either apply to everybody or they don't. And we can do this. And, it's a little disheartening now, and people are, it's hard not to be depressed when you get up and you see what these assholes are doing, but we can defeat them, as we've done in the past. We're old enough to remember that we won this in the civil rights movement, and we won in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and we won in the women's movement, and we can win again.
Well, thank you, Mike. So you'll have to come back again, and we'll figure out where we are in a couple of months.
Yeah, if we haven't been dragged off by then, but
hopefully we'll be a little off the radar.
I think we'll be okay for a while.
Thanks for coming on and
Thank you.
talking about it.
Thank you.
And I might see you on the 26th, and see you around New London in any case.
I know if you're not there, you'll be there in spirit.
When the rain don't